Hello, my name is Stephanie Toddy. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today entitled Multiple Choice Assessments for Law Professors, The Choice is Yours, presented by Ms. Beth Donahue, CEO of Bar Crowd, LLC. Ms. Donahue is a former editor and program director of the Multi-State Bar Examination, as well as a former manager of a large technical team developing online assessment programs for K-12 standardized tests. She is the co-founder of Bar Crowd, LLC, a company developing crowdsourced assessment software for use as a teaching and learning tool in law schools. Before we begin today's presentation, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have specific questions throughout the presentation, we encourage everyone to type them in through the questions feature of the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen at the moment. You can type those in at any time throughout the webinar today, and then we'll have a chance to answer all questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, at the conclusion of the webinar, you should have a quick survey pop up for you. We encourage everyone to fill this short survey out if possible. I think it's only 5 questions long, so that we can continue to provide relevant content at all of our webinars. And yes, because I know I will be asked by several people today, today's webinar is being recorded, and all attendees and registrants will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording in the next few days. Once you receive it, please feel free to share it among your peers as you would like. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Beth. Thank you so much for attending, and please enjoy the webinar.
Hi everybody, this is Beth, and thank you for joining us today. I am so excited to be here talking about my favorite topic in the world, multiple choice questions, and I can't believe that so many people want to hear me talk about it. I can tell you my husband's sick of talking about it for sure. And to have so many law professors here, this is fabulous because I myself am a lawyer, although as Stephanie told you, I've spent the bulk of my professional career actually in standardized testing. What I'm doing now with Bar Crowd is curriculum design. We're doing learning outcomes and assessment planning for specifically for legal educators, and multiple choice writing seminars and editing services. And as Stephanie already mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit about later, we've developed some crowdsourced teaching and learning tools for students, professors, and even practicing attorneys to write and edit and review each other's test questions as a way of learning content as students progress through course material. One of my passions is formative testing, which I think K-12 is really leading the way here in innovation in this area. And it's one thing that I'd really like to see used more in higher education, especially law schools. The quote here is, "The available research evidence suggests that formative assessment produces greater increases in students' achievement than class size reduction or increases in teachers' content knowledge, and at a fraction of the cost." Formative testing generally is defined as testing your students regularly throughout a course in low-stakes settings and at a frequency that is approximately every 1 to 2 weeks would be considered formative testing. And it's really doing a lot to not only increase student achievement and learning, but as the quote suggests, it's doing so in a way that is relatively cheap in terms of the investment by the school, and also helping the teachers as well as the students to know when they need to double back to course material or improve their instructional design. Formative testing drives student learning, gives feedback to both teachers and students, and corrects student misconceptions early. And I know that a lot of law professors, in talking with law professors about formative testing, They know about this research, and they know that it's a growing trend at lower school levels. But they're really worried about what kinds of questions they're going to use, because most law professors are used to using essay and performance type tests that take an enormous amount of time to grade, and so they just cannot see doing this every week or two as a matter of course during the course of the semester. And I hope what we're going to talk about today, and what I'll hopefully convince some of you, is to reconsider multiple choice so that you can take advantage of the benefits of formative testing. Before you decide which question format makes sense, though, I'd like to take a step backwards to talk about what we're doing in curriculum design right now. Is, you start with why you're teaching a course to begin with. What kinds of knowledge, skills, and abilities you want your students to get out of the course, or in other words, what's the point? What are you teaching, and why are you teaching it to begin with? In the old days, curriculum design went something like this. You pick a textbook, you write up some lesson plans, and then as you proceed through the semester or through the school year, you write some test questions and assemble exams before giving the exams in class. And of course, in law school, as you all know, often this is only done once during the semester or during an entire school year. And nowadays, what we're doing in K-12 is something called backward design, and this is really, I think, considered more and more the best practices in curriculum design. And it's done backwards. You start with, what do you want your students to get out of your course? What do you want your students to know or be able to do after taking your class? That is step one, and those are your learning outcomes. Developing those you do at the very beginning before you move on to step two, which is one step backwards. Then you start writing your test questions. How would you test a particular learning outcome? What format of a question would you use? What type of question is going to flow directly from these learning outcomes that you have already decided are the most important things that you want your students to get out of your class? And it's not until step three that then you would get to selecting course materials, textbooks, cases in the case of law school, and other materials that you might use, videos, etc. And then as you go through the course of your semester, you'll start assembling the questions you've already written and into appropriate exams along the way. So step two is really what we're here to talk about today, in terms of figuring out what kinds of questions you want to use and how multiple choice might fit into that battery of tests that you use throughout your semester. But really quickly, I want to give you an overview, because it really does have to start with your learning outcomes. What do you want your students to know and to be able to do after taking your course? And typically what comes to mind for professors is the word understand. They want students to understand, at a high level, for instance, well, I'm teaching torts, I want them to understand torts, right? And the word understand is pretty slippery, but in standardized assessment, we typically would describe it this way. To understand is to be able to wisely and effectively use, that is, transfer what we know in context, to apply knowledge and skill effectively in realistic tests and settings. So in other words, you don't just want your students to memorize a bunch of facts and spit them back to you, but you want your students to learn how to apply the knowledge that you hope they are getting from your course. So if your high-level goal is to understand torts, one of your outcomes, and this is an outcome that I would expect to see in almost every law class, some variation of this. One of your learning outcomes is likely to be that you want your students to be able to apply the prima facie elements of basic torts and a variety of fact patterns. Other possible learning outcomes, and I'm going to go over these pretty quickly so that we can then start talking about how you might test these things. Other possible learning outcomes, for instance, know the elements of the basic torts and tort defenses, make appropriate inferences from course reading materials, identify the issue that will be dispositive in a variety of tort fact patterns, assess the strength of different legal arguments, distinguish between losses that are recognized in tort law and those that are not, determine which cause of action or defense is most likely to be successful, write a persuasive legal analysis of a tort problem, formulate objective responses to a variety of client questions, create a comprehensive map or outline, conduct a simulated settlement negotiation. These are the kinds of things I would expect to see out of a tort class. And you might have fewer, you might have more than this, probably not as many as 3 times as more. There's a limit on how much you can actually cover effectively with students, but it'll be something along these lines. So once you have your learning outcomes developed, your second step is to write corresponding test questions or some sort of measurement activities that will give you an idea of whether or not your students are getting it. Well, are your students learning at what you expect them to be learning? Can they do what you expect them to be able to do? And you want to be able to write these questions before you spend time in class teaching and reviewing, because this will really help you to focus your class time on teaching what you think is important. Remember, your learning outcomes is what you think is important and what you really want students to get out of your class. So writing the questions early before you start talking about this stuff in class really helps you to stay focused throughout the semester. Now, when you decide, when you go to decide what kinds of questions you want to use for each particular learning outcome, I can boil it down to 2 fundamental questions that need to be addressed. The first is, how can I ensure that my overall array of questions will measure my learning outcomes accurately and fairly? And then the second, and this might seem kind of silly, but you'll see why I phrase it this way in a moment, which learning outcomes cannot be measured with multiple choice questions? So that first question there, how can I accurately and fairly measure all of these learning outcomes that I've said are the important outcomes I want students to get out of my class? Well, there are 2 things that, two big concepts in standardized testing and in assessment generally that educators need to be aware of and think about. The first is called validity. Validity is the extent to which you can be confident that your use of assessment scores, for example, for grading, or it could be for conferring a degree, for feedback to students, etc. But whatever use you are making of those scores, that your use is appropriate. Validity can be maximized by carefully and thoroughly documenting that you are actually testing what you intended to test. In other words, you're actually testing because your questions are quality questions, your tests are quality tests, and you're giving enough testing material to students throughout the semester that you know that you are testing what you intend to test, which again is your learning outcomes. So you can blow it in a number of ways in validity. An extreme case of how you can blow it is you teach 2 courses. You teach torts and you teach medical malpractice, and you accidentally give your tort students a medical malpractice final exam. Obviously, you're not, with the scores that you get from that test, you haven't really tested what you intended to test. A more subtle case relates to how your questions are worded and how you've written your test questions. Maybe they include a high degree of sophisticated language that's not related to the content of your torts class, vernacular language, plays on words, nuances of grammar, etc., unrelated to your learning outcomes, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that you dumb down your test questions when it comes to the legal issues that students must grapple with, but when you have language in questions that is unrelated to those legal issues, you can run into trouble. The other big concept in testing that you need to think about and grapple with when you want to accurately and fairly measure learning outcomes is reliability. And this is the extent to which you can be confident that the scores derived from your assessment are consistent across groups of similarly capable students, and that the students would be rank ordered the same if given a different set of questions covering the same content, the same learning outcomes. You can maximize your reliability by having large numbers of questions. So in other words, students can't get lucky by your selection of test questions. They aren't advantaged or disadvantaged depending on what you decided to test on the exam. And you can also maximize reliability through objective machine-based scoring. Students in that way cannot get lucky or unlucky because of human error or subjectivity of a grader. You can blow reliability in a number of ways as well. And by the way, ExamSoft is planning on doing a couple of follow-up webinars on actually more the nuts and bolts of writing multiple choice questions. And I'll talk about that at the end. I hope some people will come back and join us because I love talking about the language and the way to frame these things in a way that's really going to get at your learning outcomes. So I can talk about that all day, but not today. I hope you'll join us again. But in reliability, the extreme case of blowing it is, and I hope this doesn't sound too familiar to you all, you give only one final exam. You've got a few constructed response questions in that exam. They cover maybe a few topics and a few learning outcomes, but not all of them. You grade the exams without a rubric, without any kind of random regrading to ensure consistency of your grading, and without any second opinions from colleagues. That's actually, a pretty extreme case. You're likely not getting high reliability from that final exam if you've only got a couple of essays. In other words, if you gave your students different essays, you're likely going to see a different rank ordering of those students. More subtle cases, again, go back to how well your test questions are written. So fact scenarios presented in your questions include ambiguous terms and things of that nature, where students are going to interpret those questions in different ways that affect the way that they answer. So I like visuals a lot, and here's a visual comparison for you. Starting with validity. If you put all of your different question formats in a continuum, this is how I would assume most law professors would rank them in terms of validity. And I call it, here I'm going to refer to it as face validity, because this is a perception. And the perception is that starting with multiple choice questions, moving to essays, performance tests, simulations, and then client work in something like a clinic would be rank ordered in that direction, with client work being perceived as the most valid because it's closest to what real lawyers do, to what beginning practicing attorneys would be expected to do. And I'm going to push back on that a little bit in a minute, but I think that's probably not too terribly controversial. The problem is that reliability runs exactly the opposite direction, and this has been mathematically demonstrated. The multiple choice questions are going to have the highest reliability because you can test the most different scenarios, following from that, going down the scale the other way. Essays, performance tests, simulations, client work, fewer and fewer different scenarios can be tested, and more subjectivity and human error in grading. And I might also add, if we were to add an arrow for cost, the arrow would run the same as the reliability arrow here. Multiple choice questions, I guess it would be with the decreased cost running towards multiple choice questions, right? So I mean, which is a benefit to you and your school. They're cheaper. Everybody knows how expensive the clinics are. Simulations, a lot of standardized testing outfits have spent millions of dollars, maybe even $1 billion, trying to standardize simulations such as standardized patients for the medical boards and whatnot. Paid actors will come in and pretend to be patients, and candidates to be doctors are, have to evaluate symptoms and explain diagnoses and whatnot, and then they are graded. And there's just a ton of money that goes into this stuff. And the fact is that still the multiple choice questions turn out to be the most reliable. Now, one thing about reliability is you can't get actual validity unless you also have reliability. So reliability doesn't ensure validity, but you can't be valid without it. And other things that go into actual validity, I mean, you could spend an entire course talking about it, and I know psychometricians do. Things of the nature like, how do you provide a distraction-free environment for testing? How do you ensure people aren't cheating? Have you set learning outcomes that are reasonable, given what most people, or I guess at least your academic deans would believe you should be teaching in the course? Do your questions directly flow from those learning outcomes? Are they well written? Et cetera, et cetera. But one of those things that goes into your actual validity is reliability. You need the reliability. Now, I told you I'm going to push back a little bit on face validity. So what about thinking on your feet? What about responding to objections, triaging client issues, and something that I think is really important, being able to quickly spot faulty reasoning and being able to quickly distinguish your case from other cases in the face of questioning or opposing counsel. I think those kinds of things, we could actually make a pretty good argument. Multiple choice questions are starting to look a little bit more closely related to real practice. Certainly they might move up past essays and performance tests in that continuum. And I think everybody knows, I certainly knew a few, and I think everybody knows a person or two who did really poorly in law school, but ended up being an absolutely fabulous practicing attorney. And my theory is that those people maybe weren't the best writers, and so didn't do very well in school, where so much was hinging on their responses to essays or performance tests. But when they left law school, they found niches of real practice that allowed them to really benefit from their ability to think on their feet in fast-paced, sort of high-turnover work, relying on other strengths that I think multiple choice questions could actually test pretty well. Now, as for simulations and client work, these babies will break your heart and take your money every time, and yet we all keep coming back, and we love them so much because they really do look so much like real practice. But the fact of the matter is, and I'm not telling you not to use them, I think they're great, but they're going to take up a huge amount of time, and they're going to be very difficult to grade fairly. So, my hope today is to get people thinking about not dropping the kinds of tests that they're already using, but to start really supplementing with a good battery of multiple choice questions to ensure that they're getting some reliability there added to their courses and to their grading. So overall, how can I ensure that my overall array of questions will measure my learning outcomes accurately and fairly? If you haven't done so already, the very simple and clear answer is you need to start supplementing your essay or performance-based questions with well-constructed multiple choice. Moving on to your other question that needs to be answered when you are considering what kind of format to use to test a learning outcome. Which learning outcomes cannot be measured with multiple choice questions? Because I know you're all thinking that I've so convinced you about how wonderful multiple choice questions are that you just figure, well, I'll just use multiple choice and I don't need anything else. But sadly, there are some learning outcomes that multiple choice just isn't going to get you there. They cannot directly test certain kinds of abilities. And when we think of what we're testing in learning outcomes, they can generally be categorized in one of three ways, as knowledge, cognitive skills, or complex abilities. And to explain that a little bit further, you want your students to know something about your subject matter, to be able to apply it in realistic scenarios. That's cognitive skill, the application part. And then you want them to also be able to integrate this new knowledge and skill base with all of their other knowledge, skills, and abilities that they come to you with and that they are learning in other courses. And that integration is complex ability. So which learning outcomes cannot be measured with multiple choice questions? Multiple choice can directly measure both knowledge and cognitive skills. Multiple choice can measure whether you know the prima facie elements of various torts. They can measure if you can determine, if you can identify, apply, assess, identify the legal issue that's dispositive, apply the law to different fact scenarios, assess which legal argument is going to be strongest, distinguish what kinds of losses will be recognized and which will not be recognized, make inferences from case law. All those things can be tested with multiple choice. What cannot be directly measured are complex abilities. So learning outcomes that demand a student write, formulate, create, conduct. These are things that you're just not going to be able to get at with multiple choice. Although, and I'm going to talk about this in one of my follow-up webinars on constructing multiple choice questions, multiple choice questions can measure aspects of these complex abilities and could even, have some use in a legal writing course, although you're going to be doing mostly writing, I hope, in a legal writing course. But you certainly can do some aspects of writing in multiple choice, and K through 12 does that a lot in standardized testing, and they have a lot that I think we could learn from. So when we think about knowledge, this is what most people think of multiple choice being useful for, which is kind of a rote memorization type task. And this is a multiple choice question as shown as it would be in ExamSoft. What are the elements of civil battery? A, B, C, D. It's straight up just, do you know it or don't you know it? And a lot of people think that's the only use for multiple choice. Well, I have some more visuals for you because I like visuals. And I put together a couple little short movies for you. This is my visual interpretation of what's going on there in that kind of question that is testing just a knowledge-based learning outcome. So you've got your question, what are the elements of civil battery? You know you've got to analyze intent, contact, harm. And you can see the test question is just sort of a bouncy ball. It bounces into the different stores of knowledge where your knowledge of different cases is. It retrieves information, and you'll notice that the ball didn't actually pierce down into under the surface of any of those clusters of knowledge. And frankly, I don't think using multiple choice questions, if this is what you want to test, is terribly controversial even in the legal field, although generally we don't want to test for knowledge only in the legal field. And maybe it's not controversial because you either know it or you don't. So people don't get too worried about using multiple choice to test something like that. And here's an alternate visual of what's going on there. It's really, you know, it's Googling information, and the student is spitting it back, right back at you. So I want to move from that to showing you a visual of what you might imagine is going on when you are testing for cognitive skill. This is what that, this is what that might look like going through a student brain. And there's a test question that could be used to test cognitive skill. So now what we have is the test question is like a marble. It's following a track, a marble run, and I'll call it a cognitive skill track. The student has created these tracks between different stores of knowledge in her brain, and that's where the test question has to go in order for the student to answer. And the marble doesn't just run from one group of knowledge to the next. It actually dives down deeper into the stores of knowledge following those little analysis subtracks. And using multiple choice questions, when you use them with a fact pattern, or what we sometimes call a vignette, vignette-based multiple choice questions are excellent at testing for cognitive skills like application, how to assess, how to identify and compare, and it shouldn't be controversial, but I think it truly is controversial in the legal field. There are a number of unfair claims about multiple choice questions. I'll cover a couple of them here that are somewhat related to one another. Multiple choice questions can't directly measure cognitive skill. The most direct assessment of skill is through performance testing, writing tasks, and simulations. This is wrong. Multiple choice questions are just as direct in measuring cognitive skills as any other format that could be used to test cognitive skills. And that is to say, no question can, quote, directly measure what's going on in your brain, what cognitive skill you're using, what your skills, where your skill tracks are running and your subtracks are running in your brain. Every single kind of question format that is aimed at testing these kinds of cognitive skills are going to first ask the student to perform the cognitive skill, and then second, to demonstrate the performance of the skill in some way that you can see and score. So you could demonstrate that you've done the skill either by selecting an answer option in a multiple choice question, or by writing a response, or by explaining an answer orally. There has to be this demonstration of what just took place in your brain, allowing the professor to grade you in some way. But remember, what you're getting at when you're testing cognitive skill is you want to know that the skill has been completed and done correctly. You want to know that the track gets you to the right answer. What you're not interested in is how that answer is communicated. That's a different learning outcome. And we'll get to that in a minute. That is a complex ability. Another claim, multiple choice questions demand less rigorous cognitive skill than the same questions posed in short answer or essay format because the answers are supplied. Now, a well-written multiple choice question, like the marble shown in that little video, will follow the same overall cognitive skill track as a constructed response question. The student has to be able to apply or assess or et cetera in order to select the correct answer. It is true that a supplied answer in the multiple choice format will save time spent organizing, writing, editing a constructed response. But again, you're not measuring with a cognitive skill question, you're not measuring organization, writing, or editing skill. You're trying to measure that the student was able to apply the right legal test to the right fact pattern. And so in this regard, multiple choice is no easier than another kind of format. And to demonstrate this in sort of a quick and dirty way, answer this question in your brain, and now answer this question. And do you really think that your cognitive behavior there, when you multiply 3 times 2 and have to write 6 as opposed to select 6 from an answer, is it really that significantly different to you? And moving on to a more complex equation here, is it going to make a really significant difference to you in this situation that the answers are supplied? Is that going to make it significantly easier to do the math? And the truth is, students, when they answer test questions, no matter if it's a multiple choice question, an essay question, whatever, they use a whole variety of different strategies in answering. And I would think of it as those cognitive skill tracks are going in all kinds of different directions, connecting things in a different order depending on the student. And good students, more knowledgeable students, are going to have shortcuts built in all over the place so that they can answer faster than non-knowledgeable students, and you would expect that. One issue that I think leads to this sort of concept that, oh, multiple choice is easier because the answer's already there for you, is bad question writing. If a multiple choice question is written poorly, it can cue the students to the correct answer without having to do the analysis. But assuming that your question is well written, and if you're smart, you're going to actually use your wrong answer choices to really hit on the misconceptions that your students have. And this can be fun, especially for law professors, I think, because you all like to play devil's advocate anyway. So it can be fun to think about what is the most plausible wrong answer. And in some cases, I think you can actually turn what could have been a very simple, straightforward, short answer response. You can actually make it harder by those wrong answer choices in the multiple choice format, really pulling strings at what kinds of misconceptions your students have and teasing out where they likely are going to go wrong in doing this analysis. So we haven't shown complex abilities yet. And here's my last little video for you. about, and remember, complex abilities are writing, formulating, creating, organizing. Those kinds of tasks posed in a test question. So you see it's pretty similar in a lot of ways to a cognitive skill question. The test question still acts as a marble. It still follows that cognitive skill track and the analysis subtract, diving deep into those stores of knowledge. But in this case, because the student has to supply their own answer, the marble also follows those bridging skill tracks. It's going into other parts of the brain, other areas of knowledge and skill, and likely entering new kinds of skill tracks that I didn't actually animate in the video, but these bridging tracks are related to constructing a response. So, for example, it would be knowledge of writing structure, language structure, vocabulary. If it's an oral response, maybe it also has something to do with poise and delivery and whatnot. These other areas of the brain, other clusters of knowledge that pertain to communication that are not necessarily taught in the course that you're testing. And these kinds of skills are things that take years to develop. Writing and communicating skill generally is not something that you're going to learn in a single class, but something that you learn over time. Now, I am absolutely not saying that we shouldn't ask our students to write. It's, I think, incredibly important. I think it's a duty of teachers to challenge all their students to be connecting the knowledge and skill that they're learning in a particular course to other areas of knowledge and skill, to really be hardwiring that brain in a way that can communicate back. I mean, it's not just important to a lawyer as a professional, but it's important in all professional work to be able to communicate and organize your thinking well. But just bear in mind when you're assessing and assigning grades that students are coming to you with, I mean, unless your law school demands writing samples and doesn't allow students to enter the school without some sophisticated level of writing, which I've never heard of, your students are going to come to you with a wide variety of skill in communication, accumulated over years and years of previous education and experience. And I throw it out there: how much do you want these kinds of variations to dictate the grades that you give your students? Maybe they do have an impact on your grades. Maybe you don't want them to have a huge impact. One thing I hate hearing, though, is, well, I make my students write essays, but I don't grade on the writing. Well, okay, but that seems to me to be a huge waste of testing time, because if you're only trying to test cognitive skill, you can do that with well-crafted vignette-based multiple choice questions and do it much more reliably with way more scenarios being tested than the few essays that you've tested. And then also, I think as a practical matter, I find it a little bit hard to believe you can totally disconnect a student's ability to communicate and structure their writing from their substantive analysis. But that's one thing I hear a lot, and I just think it's, at the very least, really inefficient way to test. So Implications for the question format. Which learning outcomes cannot be measured? Multiple choice questions are not a good choice when you're measuring complex abilities. So if one of your learning outcomes is you want your students to be able to conduct a client interview or to write a brief or things of that nature, you need to make them conduct a client interview or write a brief. You're not going to get at that directly through multiple choice. However, multiple choice questions are a really good choice for testing cognitive skills, and they kind of get a bad rap by professors who doubt that. And cognitive skill is that really core application of knowledge that we said at the beginning is fundamental to the understanding of students, how they are able to transfer what they learn to new fact patterns. And again, I think it's really inefficient to try to test cognitive skills with constructed response questions. I think you start with what cannot be measured with multiple choice, and if you have learning outcomes where you want your students to write, you want your students to formulate arguments, those are the kinds of things that you build into your schedule. Make sure that you've got time to grade it, and then I would take a look at how many areas then you can sort of backfill with multiple choice questions to ensure that you're going to get the reliability that you want to get overall for your grades. I'll leave you with a list of benefits, and I told you early on that I love multiple choice questions, so maybe an essay lover could chime in here at the end and tell me all the reasons that I've left out benefits of constructed response. But constructed response do have higher face validity. Certainly, nobody's going to question you for using essay questions or performance tests. And they're able to test those complex abilities, which I think you should be testing. I think it's important. So certainly, I'm, again, not arguing that you abandon those kinds of testing formats. But when you look overall at your course, oh my goodness, think of those benefits that you can get from multiple choice. You add 50 to 100 questions of multiple choice, you're going to get high reliability, you're going to get way more scenarios, and that objective grading. And here are some benefits that I haven't really talked about, but I'll throw them out quickly. And feel free to shoot me an email. I'm going to put my email up at the end here if you want me to follow up on any of these things. Everybody writes questions that occasionally just don't perform well. As everybody blows it, and you don't know why, but it just didn't work. If you've got 100 questions, it's sure easier to throw out a question that isn't performing well, as opposed to a few essays. Multiple choice questions have very simple instructions. It can be as simple as choose the best answer. Everybody sort of intuitively knows what you're asking them to do, and you don't have to waste testing time with students reading through detailed instructions. Multiple choice questions are easy to mix and match. You can reuse them in different combinations as your course changes over time. You can easily put them into different combinations to use down the road at different points in the semester. Statistics that you get back on multiple choice, this is just gold. You can so often see exactly where people are going wrong, so that, hey, if everybody answers B and you know B is the wrong answer, first of all, you know your students' misconceptions, but you also know, oh, maybe I better look at that question a little bit closer. It can really help you edit your work and get your, really perfect your questions over time, keeping an eye on those statistics. And most importantly, for the purposes of this webinar, if you're interested in formative assessment and you see formative assessment as really, an evolving best practice that you want to see, shared in higher education and law school, which I do. I really see multiple choice as the most practical option here, maybe the only practical option, because I mean, professors have great pressures on them to publish and do other kinds of work, and I mean, just the reality of it is they probably aren't going to have the time to grade essays every week. It's going to give your students higher achievement, better retention over time. The more you test, the better students are going to retain their knowledge, and you're going to see continuous improvement in your curriculum because, again, it's giving you feedback as well as your students. A few extra benefits with multiple choice. When you combine them with technology, which is what BarCrowd is really excited about doing, you can get real-time feedback and amazing reporting options. ExamSoft's rubrics program is really cool when you're using essays, but for multiple choice questions as well, you can tie all of your learning outcomes directly to questions and get put together reports in the blink of an eye for your academic support staff to really target where student areas of need are. You get collaborative question writing and review. That's one of the things BarCrowd would really like to see happening is professors writing questions and sharing them with each other and reviewing them and using them, using other people's work, editing other people's work. All of this can be done now with new technologies and online so that you don't even have to be in the same room. Multiple choice allows you to do adaptive testing. That's when you have a different set of questions for each student depending on how they are answering questions as they go through a test. So the test is actually adapting to the student's responses, and adaptive testing is really good at diagnosing differences in ability at the high end and at the low end of your student population. So that's something that I'm not sure if anybody's doing that in the legal field or not yet, but it's certainly something that can be done with multiple choice. And then shared question banks, which again is something that BarCrowd is hoping to do. You could have students writing questions to test their own knowledge. Peer review, getting a lot of really big supporters in higher education. You can have shared question banks for professors. Hey, I mean, why recreate the wheel, right? If you all wrote 10 questions and put them into a shared bank, everybody could benefit from that. And it's a very easy way to bring in practicing lawyers. Have practicing attorneys in your field reviewing your test questions and giving you tips on what they're seeing in the real world in practice, whether your scenarios are realistic, or writing questions that you use for students. So it can be a very low-cost way to involve the practicing bar. So I'm just about done here. I'll give you my email address in a moment. Again, if you're interested in any of this, we're doing a couple of webinars that will dive into the nuts and bolts of drafting multiple choice questions. And BarCrowd is also available if you want to talk about developing learning outcomes. If you want more drafting training or editing of multiple choice questions, if you want to talk about some kind of shared question banking, or if you're interested in talking about doing benchmark exams that are more of a summative nature, that could be given across schools so you or your administrators could see how your students are doing compared to students in other schools. All of these things, I think, are going to be evolving and gaining popularity in the years to come. And I think it's a really exciting time in higher education overall. And we're coming at this from an assessment angle that's a little bit different than what a lot of other people may be talking about. But we think that multiple choice specifically has an enormous role to play. So our upcoming webinars, May 1st, and then just a few days later, May 13th, The first one, I'm going to talk about just the real basics of how do you go about writing a multiple choice question in law specifically. If you're interested in trying it, where do you get ideas? How do you frame your ideas? And then how do you edit your questions to make sure those option choices aren't cueing anybody, but are plausible to at least some segment of your test takers. And then in a follow-up on May 13th, do this, not that. I'm going to talk about all of the bad ways to write multiple choice questions or frame them. There are lots of different kinds of multiple choice questions, and most of them are really bad. Again, maybe leading to a bad perception of multiple choice that isn't fair when they are well written. So I hope that you will come back and join us for those webinars. And if you have any thoughts, questions, ideas for us at BarCrowd, that is my email address on the screen. Beth Donahue is my name, bdonahue@barcrowd.net. And it's been my pleasure to be here. I guess Stephanie is going to take over and share any questions that you all have.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Webinars Made Easy.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. Really appreciate that. That was a great presentation. Again, I'd just like to remind everyone at this point, if you do have questions, please go ahead and pose them through the questions portion of the GoToWebinar control panel. You can just type them in, I'll read them out, and then we'll have Beth answer them as they come up. I already have received this question a couple of times from folks, so I just wanted to reiterate, yes, we are recording this webinar. Yes, we will email it out to everybody once we get it uploaded to our site. That link should be emailed out to everybody within the next couple of days, probably at the beginning of next week. And so everybody should be receiving a link to the recording, within the next couple of days. We're going to go ahead and take a couple of questions now really quickly because Beth's presentation was so amazing. It ran a little bit longer, but that's great. The more content, the better. Beth, quick question. We've got one that just came in. Is there any way to give a multiple choice question test on ExamSoft since we already use them?
Well, Stephanie, you can answer that one. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, ExamSoft you can use for multiple choice. As Stephanie showed, I think the very first screen that I showed a multiple choice, it was the one without a fact pattern, but you can give multiple choice questions with or without those vignettes within ExamSoft, definitely.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
It's super easy to upload, too.
Yes, they are. You can upload any type of questions or import questions that you have from multiple different types of sources. So if you already are a client of ExamSoft and you have questions on how to do that, please get with your account manager. They're more than happy to walk you through that process. The next question.
Something I'll throw out, maybe this is more information than the question demanded, but if you are putting together exams that mix formats, so for instance, you want to use 30 multiple choice questions and 3 essays, something like that, you should segregate the different formats into sections so that the student isn't going from question to question and bouncing into different formats. Give a simple set of instructions for multiple choice questions, let them do their multiple choice, get all of those multiple choice questions out of the way, and then give them their instructions for the next format. So then you'd have essay instructions or whatever, and do your essays together. Don't think you're going to, save somebody's wrist if anybody's still writing exams, which they probably aren't. I just gave away my age, I guess. But don't try to mix them up to keep your students' interest or save them from typing or writing too much. it's very disorienting to switch from format to format.
Exactly. That's great advice. Thank you, Beth. Next question we had was, in order to gain the depth of insight you've been speaking on, how often are multiple choice question tests or formative assessments necessary?
I would say the research shows that to get the most out of formative testing, you want to test at least every 3 weeks.
Great, thank you. Next question is, can multiple choice on ExamSoft be graded anonymously? Would you like to answer that, or shall I?
Go ahead, Stephanie. I've been talking too much.
Well, that's okay. I know that some people aren't aware of all the different types of things that you can do through the software. So yes, I mean the easy answer to that question is yes. So whenever you create the exam within ExamSoft, everything is graded automatically. If you're doing a rubric grading, the functionality is not quite there yet, but it will be as of this summer for multiple people to be chosen as graders, and I believe that option for those multiple different graders to be anonymous will be available this summer. It looks like that is our last question, so that actually wraps us up right at 4 o'clock at 1 hour. This is going to be my last call to questions. If anybody has one, throw it in now. Otherwise, we did just want to remind everyone that we have those 2 webinars coming up with Beth in May. We will be sending out more information as we get closer to those dates, so don't worry if you missed all that information. We'll send out links to register in the next month or so. If you have any questions, you see her email address there on the screen, or if you have questions for ExamSoft, you can email us at info@examsoft.com. Again, we will be shooting out the link to the recording of the webinar at the beginning of next week, so look for that in your email boxes as well. I'd like to really thank Beth for being here today and giving a really wonderful presentation. This has been just a really, really big treat for me. I'm really into multiple choice questions or formative assessment for legal ed as well. So thank you so much, Beth, for being here, and we're really looking forward to your next presentations.
Yeah, sure. Thanks to ExamSoft for putting this on, and thanks everyone for giving me the chance to talk about my favorite thing.
Thanks so much. Everybody have a great day.